Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Christmas edition of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. As always, I'm Robb Nelson.
And I'm Mike Bakov, and hey, Rob, do you know why Santa Claus is a fan of the metric system?
I don't, but as Sugar Pun Fairy, I think you're going to tell us all.
Fairy. That's better than the punchline for the joke, which is that it includes the Santa meter.
God. I don't know. I think we both lose.
Yeah, I think the audience loses, really. So there you go. Merry Christmas. So this is the first of what's probably going to be, two Christmas podcasts that we're going to throw at you for the season?
Yeah, we're going to do a two-part Christmas podcast because there's just so much to talk about, so much history and stories about this holiday that we're all going to get into. So in the first part, we're going to be talking with Casanova, who's our director of interpretation. In the second episode, we're going to be talking with curator of Stuhr Museum, Kari Stofer, and our real-life Santa Claus, Larry Roberts, who has played the part for many years here at Stuhr Museum and also a few other places around town as well.
Yeah, if you've been out to Stuhr during Christmas, you know Larry probably from a number of different things, including North Pole Express. So he was a great talk, and yeah, let's get into some Christmas.
And we are back with the Christmas edition of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I am here joined with Stuhr Museum curator Kari Stofer. Kari, thank you for being on the show.
How's it going?
So today we are going to be talking about all things Christmas related, a deep history in this country and the world. There's so many angles we could take this from. But I'd like to kind of start at the origins of the holiday. Like why December 25th and
well, right there you hit the biggest rabbit hole ever. So
okay, well, tell me about it.
Christian believers believe that it is the day we celebrate Jesus's birth, but the origin of it and how that date was actually picked, there's several different theories. There's the theory that you can kind of connect it to early pagan religions and the celebrations that they had. That's one I tend to kind of gravitate towards. There's also, it's the Saturnalia that is probably where we get a lot of our traditions. But there's also a really sweet little origin story where there was a celebration of light that was in the spring, and that there are some people that believe that that's when Jesus was conceived, and therefore if you go 9 months down, then you get December 25th. So there's a lot of different ways that you could look at the origin of Christmas, whether you want to go into all of that history or you want to look at that where we're at right now with Christmas is really a product of a lot of commercialism mixed in with all of those origin stories.
Yeah, and Christmas has like a second rebirth as well. In the 19th century, there was a long stint of Puritan American history there for a while, and then after that kind of begins to fade in like the late 19th century with industrialization and the changing nature of what childhood meant and like a value placed on a children's life and experience. Like you see that kind of gradual transformation of the holiday into something more family oriented.
Yeah, because the Puritan movement really in Europe came to America, and Christmas was not popular because of those sort of ancient rituals where people actually, it was sometimes a whole week of debauchery and drunkenness and Christmas celebrations like we've never seen.
Yeah.
And so, they kind of put a kibosh on that. But then after the American Revolution, people looked at bringing it back and kind of reshaping it and reforming it and kind of pushing it where it is today.
There's one thing that I'd like to mention, and it's something that we've continued, but in a completely different way. The Scandinavians, in a part of Norse mythology, celebrated what was called Yule, Y-U-L-E, from December 21st, starting at the winter solstice until early January. And they had Yule logs. That was their tradition. And the tradition was that people would bring home very, very large logs to set on fire for the season, and the people would light those huge logs and feast until the entire log was consumed, which usually took about 12 days. And from that, we get the Yule log that everyone's. I don't think anyone really knows, or at least I didn't, what a Yule log means. But
And they also, each spark that came off that Yule log would signify how many pigs they would be able to, I guess, make.
Yeah, in the
in
coming
spring.
year, it was like
yeah,
for
how much the harvest was, and so you wanted to go get the biggest log you could find and leave it on fire.
and that's such a cool tradition that somehow, of all the things that have, managed to hang on, that one is still like in some form still kind of alive.
Yeah, well, they also say, there's also mythology around the fact that Odin, who's the Norse god, he would fly through the air on a horse with 8 legs. And so there you go. You got your 8 reindeer. You got your flying through the air. Odin's usually depicted with the big white beard. I think the story goes is that he would decide who was going to be blessed and who wasn't going to be blessed. So then you've got your naughty and your nice. So just one more deep myth to go down.
No, I read that about that as well. I did not make that connection. I was just like, wow, this is a bad guy. Like,
He's Santa.
Yeah, that was my takeaway. You mentioned the Saturnalia festival. That was a very popular Roman tradition from very, very early on, celebrating the sun as well. So there's always that connection to pagan sun worship and just kind of that time of year of it's celebrating that it's going to be this day, the December 21st, but 25th, that sort of time of the year is as bad as it's going to get in terms of darkness and cold, and we're returning again to a time of warmth and prosperity.
A time of birth and renewal.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I think that's where kind of the story begins, at least.
Well, I think so, and I think the early Christian church wanted to make sure that they could kind of replace that festival, talk people into it. It's a good marketing strategy, and if it happens to line up, then with any of the earlier myths, there's really nothing in the Bible that can back that data up. But I've seen glorious amounts of research backing different things up. The Saturnalia was a really popular, total debauchery, total drunkenness. The slaves were put in charge, and there was just, I can't even probably say on the radio what all took place. There's even rumors of human sacrifice. They also worshipped Mithra, who was a female goddess, and for a lot of people, that was a very sacred day. Mm-hmm. So you've got both of those things going on, and so to kind of for the church to kind of match it up and kind of slowly replace that. What I think is interesting that I didn't know was that all of that crazy partying and that part of Christmas, that continued for centuries.
A long time.
Yeah. That's not the way we celebrate Christmas.
No. But, you make a good point about, the kind of the political maneuvering behind the scenes of aligning an important Christian holiday that, is on the rise early in the 400s AD with holidays that have already been, ingrained into the culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. Because, to make the analogy, it's a lot easier to just replace the sign out in front on the building than it is to tear down the building and build everything up from scratch. So people are already used to coming to your building, so just change the sign out front and keep the holiday
right.
The holiday.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good analogy. I would point out that by 600 AD, people had changed to the holiday had been changed.
Yeah.
To a Christian origin, and that's a pretty quick turnaround, even for a nice shiny sign. So,
for people
there's something that really existed there, and there was a movement. But somehow, I think we hold on to the party part quite forcefully.
I think it's just human nature, personally. But let's fast forward to a more modern framework. When we're talking about Christmas enduring, there was a time when it did not endure in American history for quite a while. In Christmas, what I'm talking about is Christmas being banned in America for about 20 years.
Yeah, it was banned definitely in Massachusetts when, a lot of the first people that came over to settle were Puritans. The whole partying idea was not in line with their idea of what the gospel and what Christianity was all about. It was banned in Boston, and you could be fined 5 shillings for showing any Christmas spirit.
Yeah, the point behind this being that the Puritans tried to have a society where any of the legislation that they passed didn't conflict with the Bible. And they pointed to at least their interpretation of the Bible in that there was no mention of a date in the Bible of Jesus's birth, and there was no mention of this sort of celebration happening or a nativity scene at all. So they chose to kind of strike it from the record. And
so early Puritans, even way back before that, they didn't think that celebrating birthdays were important, because that is another tradition that pagans had, is celebrating the birthday. And, when you were talking about celebrating saints' birthdays and things like that early on, they weren't in favor for that because they didn't see that as your birth. They thought like your moment of sainthood, your moment of transformation, your moment of faith would be your birthday. And so that was another reasoning they gave for that you don't celebrate birthdays. So
yeah, and so like this began in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because we were not a country yet in the normal sense. And it lasted for a good 20 years before, a new generation kind of would bring this institution back. But even since then, it's emerged and become several different things along the way. Yeah,
since then. I do think it's interesting that the first, season of Jamestown, John Smith did make a note in his ledger that they celebrated Christmas without incident or something like that. Yeah. So there was still some, behind the door celebrations.
Yeah.
Those Jamestown crazy people.
So when does Christmas, do you think, take on the form that it would be recognizable to Americans today? If you had to pick a time.
I think the turn of the 20th century, probably 10, 20 years plus or minus. I think that there was a concerted effort to bring Christmas and a certain look of Christmas back. And then I think there were some really integral pieces of literature and artwork that transformed everything. You know you enjoy Thomas Nast and his work. So I don't know if you want to chat a little bit about that, but there were also Dr. Clement Moore, who did 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, Charles Dickens, who did A Christmas Carol. So there were a lot of really poignant things right at that time.
Yeah, and I'll definitely want to jump in on those and contribute my piece. I found 3 really fun facts, I think, that probably no one has any reason to know, but I think that are fun. So starting in 1851, there's a New York woodsman named Mark Carr, and he is credited with opening the first ever Christmas tree lot with trees for sale. So in 1851, that happened. In 1870, on June 26, Christmas was established as an American holiday for the country. And not on a day, but in 1890, James Edgar of Brockton, Massachusetts, is credited with being the first in-person performer of Santa Claus. He had a suit made for his dry goods store, and he welcomed patrons to come in and talk with Santa. And I don't think it was with kids yet, but the idea caught on a few years after that. So starting in 1890, that became a tradition in department stores for kids to come and talk and meet with Santa Claus. So those 3 things, I think, show kind of a clear progression that by, like Kari said, by 1900, you see America really begin to embrace Christmas in a way that would be familiar to us today.
Yeah, and I think that's where commercialism kind of took off and took those stories, and Coca-Cola actually helped invent our image of Santa Claus that we have right now. It's certainly not based off of a starving saint way back in history. It actually was one of the guys that ran Coca-Cola. He had a friend who had a chubby face, so they modeled their advertising off of him, and they insisted on him having a Coca-Cola red Christmas suit. And that's what Santa looks like to now, is the Coca-Cola Christmas guy.
Really?
So, yeah.
I think they definitely drew on some stuff. Like, I'm sure that Coca-Cola, which is just a monstrosity of a company, has had definitely its impact. I found like this, progression of poetry that kind of informed our interpretation of what Santa Claus was, just kind of starting in the 18 teens. You can see in the poem The Night Before Christmas, they talk about Santa Claus as he was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes how they twinkled, his dimples how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. That was from 1818. So, I mean, there's like that glimmer of what Santa Claus would ultimately look like. Other people would draw on this later on, and you get to the 1860s through the 1880s, and a very, very popular cartoonist from that period who wrote for Harper's Weekly, he would be the first person to kind of illustrate Santa Claus in a way that would be recognizable today. Nast's illustrations included a very long pipe, and they make Santa Claus look a little bit more rustic, I think, than you would recognize him as today.
Nast's Santa Claus is more of like a Father Christmas type.
Yeah.
So he's got the long robe and the more pointed beard, not so quite fluffy. Sometimes the pointed hat that's kind of up like a nightcap. Yeah,
Yes.
so very much a Father Christmassy type.
And a lot of those other traditions that we were talking about a little bit earlier, like
The Yule log and
Odin with a horse of 8 legs. Nast will write about 8 tiny reindeer and, you know, some of those other things associated with Santa Claus, like elves, I think, and a sleigh and the North Pole. And, you know, Odin is from Iceland. And so, I mean, there's still like that just kind that gradual transformation of the myth from the original stories.
Right, and how much of that was just kind of felt and how much of it was intent, I think is, you know, something you can argue, but definitely the connections were made and resonated and took off.
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely.
So we kind of dove into that. I'd like to talk about, you know, some of the traditions of Christmas that, I mean, there have been a lot that has, there have been a lot of things that have endured, but some things really, I don't feel like have. But we were talking a little bit before the podcast, like maybe they haven't. I'm not privy to them. One of the things I wanted to bring up was the Christmas pickle. I have never heard of this until about 3 hours ago, but apparently I'm the only one that hasn't. Would you care to enlighten us about what a Christmas pickle is, Kari?
Well, the Christmas pickle is literally a Christmas ornament that looks like a dill pickle. The myth is that it's a German tradition to hide it in the Christmas tree, and then the next morning or whenever your family chooses, whoever finds the pickle first gets an extra gift.
And it's a real
and
pickle,
we call it. No, it's not a real pickle.
Was it ever a real pickle?
I don't believe it was ever a
Okay.
real pickle.
I think that's the confusion then. I could believe finding an ornament. That's more down.
Yes.
to
No,
earth.
there are hand-blown ornaments. They're usually glass. And Germany, among many other countries around there, are known for their glass blowing and their decorative ornaments. And so that was a thing.
Does it have a German origin?
There's myth that it does have a German origin. I think it probably pretty much has a commercial origin.
Gotcha.
In fact, I would definite leads that lead back just to when it was commercialized, and there's really nothing before that. Now, so that's, and a lot of traditions with Christmas would happen that way. You know, when you're talking about the literature and, you know, the different things that they would put in there, they would say, hey, this is our tradition. It's been a tradition for 20 years. I think Charles Dickens was kind of known for that, talking about a tradition that never really existed, but all of a sudden, people now, their imaginations believe it existed. And so it's like instant tradition. And I think that's the pickle's a good example of that.
Yeah. And, you know, Dickens has a large role with A Christmas Carol. That story has a very important part, or plays a very important part in the tradition that emerges at that same time, late 19th century, with charity and, you know, gift, maybe not gift giving, but like just thinking about others and being around family and
Workers' rights.
Exactly.
Children's rights, child abuse, poorhouses, all of that, mental health. He pretty much, touches on a lot of that.
Yeah, and I mean, it wasn't a coincidence because all of those things were occurring in the 1880s, 1890s in the places that he was writing about, London, New York City, and on the other side of the ocean. You know, your big cities are in dire straits. And, stories like this really sparked that conversation of how are we going to move forward from this?
Yeah. Dickens is amazing. I just have to point out that when I was learning about Dickens, I found that I read that he actually wrote A Christmas Carol because he was really broke and he needed some quick money. And he literally wrote it in a matter of hours and days and pumped out all of that analogy and all of that visualization. Just be like, hey, yeah, I need some extra Christmas cash. I don't know if you're out there, a little extra form of cash, write a quick Christmas story.
Some people just have the gift.
Right?
It's just one of those things. Well, I guess the last question I would just have to ask you is more on a personal note. Is there a favorite, holiday myth or tradition that you've kind of gravitated towards in your life that you find really interesting? And is there a historical origin to that, myth or tradition?
Well, I don't know that there's a historical origin, although it's interesting because we do the Christmas pickle at my house.
Really?
And have destroyed a branch and tree. So maybe this does. When all the kids were born, all the grandkids on my mom's side of the family, we each got an ornament every year. And most of those ornaments came from my aunt, my mother, my grandmother, and they were all handmade. And all of us kids would get one. And so I literally am not going to tell you how many for each year I have, but you can imagine that it's more than 25 and times 3. And so every year, all of us have a tree up that has all of those ornaments. And so if you go around to your cousin's house, your sister's house, you can see the years of spending Christmas together and all the different memories. And you could almost remember what year you got what. And we all have that shared memory. So I guess the Christmas ornament is one of my favorite things about my family tradition. I would not include the pickle in that, but now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know, maybe.
It sounds like you've found an appreciation for it in the last 20 minutes.
What about you? You got to tell.
Well, I happened upon my answer just this last weekend because there happened to be a movie about Mrs. Santa Claus on my TV, and I was always wondering why she didn't have a first name. You always just hear about Mrs. Claus, and maybe in one of the older movies she has a name like Anna or Jessica, like in the claymation movies from the 70s or whenever those were. Sorry. I don't know what year it was. Sorry. But so I kind of looked into this.
I'm not dating myself on that one either.
I kind of looked into this, but clearly I was not the first person to have this same thought, because as early as in 1889, there was a poem written by Catherine Lee Bates called Goody Santa Claus, where Catherine Lee Bates gives Mrs. Santa Claus a first name, although the first name is Goodwife. So
oh my gosh,
there's not a really good moral to that story, but the poem itself does have some pretty key lines, and it really establishes this idea that at a time when we're talking about women's suffrage and women's equality, the late 19th century, early 20th century, that women need to be acknowledged for their contribution to whatever industry they are a part of. And that's really the purpose of this poem. And Bates writes that from the perspective of Mrs. Claus, from Goodwife Claus, where she says, this is Mrs. Claus speaking, "Why should you have all the glory of the joyous Christmas story, and poor little goody Santa Claus have nothing to do but the work? You just sit here and grow chubby off the goodies in my cubby, from December to December till your white beard sweeps your knees. For you must allow, my good man, that you're nothing but a lazy woodman, and rely on me to foster all our fruitful Christmas trees." That was from 1889, so Mrs. Claus definitely had a bone to pick with old Saint Nick.
An axe to grind.
Spin a rhyme. Yeah, and that wouldn't be the only one. I also found a one-act comedic play from 1914. A one-act play from 1914 called Mrs. Claus Militant. Here's a passage from that play.
I can't wait.
From Mrs. Claus. "Here I sit year after year in Iceland, dressing dolls and making candy bags and aprons and slippers and caps and whatnot. And when they're all done, Mr. Santa Claus just packs them in his sleigh and hitches his deer, and away he goes to have all the fun and all the thanks. She steals the sleigh and delivers the presents," is the moral of the story. I won't go into all of it. But and then at the end of the story, Santa invites her to do the same from then on. So it has the happy ending of equality and inclusion of Mrs. Claus in the story. I just found that to be really, I had no idea that this trope existed.
That's from 1914?
Yes, 1914. And the poem before that was from 1889. So clearly people were thinking about the woman behind the throne, if you will, from this early date.
Well, that's 6 years before women got the right to vote. So
Exactly.
yeah, it's pretty good correlation there. However, I think Santa's still traditionally leading the pack there. So maybe we need to get that poem out. And except, I don't know, I'm okay staying at home in front of the fireplace and letting somebody else run around town deliver the presents. I don't know what that says.
Teach their own. I don't know. I feel for her. I'm glad that somebody took up that torch for Mrs. Claus.
Absolutely. That's really interesting.
But that's all that I think we have time for today. Really appreciate you joining us for this edition of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. Have a great holiday. Have a great new year. And we will be back early on in 2021.
Happy holidays.
Today's podcast is brought to you by the Silver Dollar. The Silver Dollar on South Front Street is in every respect first class. Serving fine lemonades, sparkling fresh sodas, delectable ice cream, fresh popped buttery popcorn, and the most excellent sandwiches in every style for all who are in a search of a good meal or a great snack.
Welcome back to the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I'm here with Larry Roberts, famous at Stuhr Museum, longtime worker and friend of the museum. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here today, and I'd like to share some of my experience as Santa here at Stuhr, or as importantly, the introduction to my role playing as a Santa Claus. It was not an intentional thing on my part. My first experience with Santa Claus was with the Hamilton County employees. I was asked to stand in when their Santa's helper couldn't show up. The gifts were in a bag, and they were all arranged so that they would be gender specific. The first gift I handed out, and I was dressed rather bulkily because I was only 155 pounds at the time. Between the costume, the beard, the hair, and all, I couldn't see much of what I was getting out of the bag. The first thing I pulled out of the bag, I gave to the county sheriff, and it was an apron. So I was not asked to do Santa Claus again in Hamilton County.
Great start.
It was a faux pas that shouldn't be repeated. My introduction here to being Santa comes from my pretty ill-advised statement that if it didn't involve singing, dancing, or wearing tights, I was willing to do it. So when Santa left his post at some point, I was asked to fill in. The experience has been very gratifying in a lot of ways, very surprising in other ways. But my preparation for the role as Santa involves, or has always involved, teaching the early family life, or what's known now as Winter on the Plains, where we read the night before Christmas, all through the house. Not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. Well, that pretty much gets me in a more festive mood. In my last life, before Stuhr, I was a mailman, and I am the biggest bah humbug when it comes to Christmas that you will know, because Christmas was a time when, of course, our workload dramatically increased, and the hours were longer, and the weather was bad, and Christmas was not a time I looked forward to. But since I have been here and doing the role of Santa, or Santa's helper, it's been a much more exciting time for me.
Are you excited to deliver all those letters to yourself then? All those letters to Santa probably ended up with you, I would imagine.
Yes, absolutely. And they wound up in the local newspaper for the most part. Some of them were very poignant. Some were a little demanding, I guess you could say. It was all part of that process of learning the gift giving and receiving process for the kids, I guess. One of my favorite Santa stories involves three sisters.
Okay.
They attended church with me, with their parents. And so, dressed as Santa, I was sitting in the sleigh, and two of the girls walked up. And I asked where their sister was. And the youngest's eyes got very big, and she says, "You know my sister?" And I said, well, of course I do. I know everyone. And she said, well, she was busy tonight. So in the process, Grandma heard about this, and she called me that night at home and asked if I was going to be Santa the next night. I told her I would be there, and she said, well, the third sister would be there. So when I walked up, I called all three of them by name. Grandma called me later that night and said I had just bought her another year or two of belief.
Very cool. Were there, what's the most, or some of the most unique or bizarre gifts you've ever, encountered being asked of you as Santa Claus?
Well, not bizarre or anything, but some of the most emotional gifts were a young person would ask not for something for themselves, but for an aunt to be cured of cancer, or for their father or their uncle to return home from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, something of that sort. I found those times to be just absolutely emotionally draining, and I would have to take a break and just regroup. There's just a point where you're so impacted by some of that you don't know how to respond. It's just very emotionally draining at that point. But the thing that always surprised me was the number of children that didn't have any idea what they wanted for Christmas. And I think the impact that I take away from that is that our children today have more things than they possibly can use. And of course, at that point, my response was, well, if you don't know what you want, what you're going to get is socks. That was always something that brought a chuckle to most of them, or at least the parents.
That sounds ideal to me. I want some socks this year.
Well, in our household, that's probably a good thing, but for children, maybe not.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed the return people, the ones that would get their picture taken with me to use as part of their Christmas card, or the cloggers that have always been part of our Christmas here at Stuhr would all come and have their picture taken around the sleigh with me. One little girl, when I was Santa Claus out at the mall, or Santa's helper at the mall, I was sitting in the chair and watching the kids as they walked up. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, and her brother, maybe 4 or 5, walked up, and ever so often she would just kind of give him an elbow and give him a shove. She walked up, and it was finally her turn to sit on Santa's lap. She sat down and had a list. It was a laundry list of things that she wanted for Christmas. And I stopped her after a little bit, and I said, no, wait a minute. Only the really good little girls get those kind of gifts. Have you been a really good little girl? And she said, well, yes. And I looked her in the eye, and I said, that's not what the elves tell me. And in fact, they tell me if you shove your little brother just one more time, you go straight on to the naughty list. Her eyes got as big as saucers, and she turned to her mom and says, Mom, it's the real Santa.
That's amazing. You mentioned the kind of kids today, at least, not knowing what they want because they have too much. How many years have you been Santa just in total?
Oh, probably not more than 10.
Okay. I was wondering if you had seen any trends, if that was the same from when you started until the present moment, if that has always been the case.
I think it has gotten worse over the last several years, but it really is not something new. I think in the last 20 years, our affluence probably shows in what kids ask for. One day, one of the little boys asked for a gun, and I looked at Mom and got this big frown, and so I ad-libbed. I said, the reindeer get real nervous when I put guns in the sleigh, so that's something that you're going to have to talk to your dad about, and probably not a good Christmas gift. And they would just accept that kind of an answer.
That's a pro answer from a Santa Claus right there. That was like not your first rodeo.
No, certainly not. You develop a certain sense of what the parents are looking for too. They want some ideas for Christmas also, so they're listening very intently to what their young people are asking.
Absolutely.
And it's as much for them as it is to introduce the children to Santa Claus. One of the things that always was a big problem was, how do you get young children, infants, to sit on Santa's lap and not be afraid or not to pull the beard out? If a parent came in with a child and they were just having a fit, I would just tell the parent to turn that child toward them, hold them tight and comfort them, and then come at me with that child with their back toward me. Because basically what they wanted was a picture at that point.
Sure.
If they could set that child in my lap and just step aside long enough to get the picture taken, it was very effective. The minute the child turned and looked at me, the tears would start again, but you had just those 10 or 15 seconds to get that picture taken. Or you'd have mom hold the baby beside me and take a picture that way with mom and the child and Santa, and that would be maybe baby's first Christmas or something.
It's a big job being Santa Claus. There's so many kids. There's so many parents. It's the same. I feel like it's very repetitive.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you have to do to like prepare yourself for that job? And like what I guess inspired you to be Santa Claus, and what's kept you coming back all these years of doing it?
Nothing inspired me to be Santa Claus.
Yeah,
It was, I was asked, and I had opened my mouth and said, I won't sing, dance, or wear tights, but I'll be anything you want me to be. So Santa Claus I was. And apparently it was effective enough with my ho, ho, ho that they kept me at it for quite some time. We talk about belief in Santa Claus. I had an older gentleman here at Stuhr approach me, and he wanted me to stand beside him and get his picture taken because he had told his grandson that he was a personal friend of Santa Claus. And the boy was just at that age where he didn't quite believe, but he wasn't sure yet. And Grandpa thought if he could get a picture with Santa Claus and send it to the young man, then he could prove that Santa did exist, and that even though Grandpa was old, he still had a personal connection to Santa Claus.
Absolutely. Well, that's a pretty neat story. I mean, I'm sure you just have a ton of those. I wanted to ask you, well, I was just going to try to tie this into history. I know we talked about on a previous podcast about your history in the as a postal carrier.
Yes.
And I know you have an appreciation for the history of that subject so much that you wrote a book about it, even, or just your own personal experiences with it. Do you have any, favorite parts of history that involve Santa Claus, and have you incorporated any of those stories into your performance?
Well, when I was teaching the early family life or Winter on the Plains, of course, the book The Night Before Christmas, when you read that, you talk about sugar plums, and you talk about chimneys, and you talk about sashes and shutters. These things don't exist in our current vernacular, our current society. And so it was interesting when you would point out to the children that book was written 200 years ago, and that it did incorporate a certain amount of the historical context of what gifts were expected at that point. We would open gifts at the end of the class, and the gifts were either homemade or very inexpensive in the context of today's gifts. So, yeah, the historical concept of Santa Claus, I'm not a great promoter of the history, probably, in that respect, but I had a lot of fun with it and thoroughly enjoyed the role as Santa. One of the things that I always enjoyed was surprising people by knowing them. I would sit here and somebody would walk by and I would call them by name and it'd about jump out of their skin because Santa's not supposed to know who they are, And
Sure.
It was always fun that way, that the all-knowing Santa Claus would be aware of who they were and what they might expect for Christmas.
Well, in addition to being Santa Claus at Stuhr Museum, you're also the conductor of the North Pole Express that we have
Yes.
here as well. How would you compare that experience to playing Old St. Nick?
Well, the North Pole Express is a magical experience. It just transforms the experience of rail travel to draw the children into the Christmas story. They can see the magic of the North Pole and the elves and Santa Claus and just that concern for the proper gift. So the two tie in very well together, and both are very enjoyable experiences for me.
Well, that's about all that I wanted to hit. I'll just open the floor to you. If you had anything else that you wanted to talk about, by all means, go ahead.
Well, one thing about it is that I have been out here long enough. I have been part of Stuhr Museum for about 14 years. And so sometimes when the kids would come and see Santa, they'd come up and whisper in your ear. If they were a little older, "You're Larry, aren't you?" And I had a young man, or not a young man, he was an older handicapped fellow sat on my lap one day, and he just talked and he talked and he talked, and I got so hot I about passed out. It's you cover all ranges of emotions and behaviors. I enjoyed the nights when they would do the pets, and you'd come in and get their picture taken with their pets. But really, I think I've covered most of the range of things that impressed me about the role of Santa Claus out here, or Santa's helper.
Okay. Larry Roberts, thank you for being on the podcast. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
Stick with us, and we'll be back after these words. Thanks for joining us on this Christmas edition of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I had a good time today, Mike.
Yeah, that was some really fascinating stuff. And then closing it up with Larry having that hands-on experience behind the beard. You know, I see documentary Behind the Beard.
You already have the title. That's half the battle.
Yeah, there you go. So we're going to take a little bit of a break now, and we're going to come back and do some podcasts in 2021. Is that about right?
That is correct. We're going to conclude the season on a high note here with 2 episodes of the Christmas special. Take a little bit of break to start in the new year, and then, probably get right back into it come spring 2021.
Yeah, well, we appreciate everyone sticking with us this year. It's been an experiment, but I think it's been a great one, and we are ready for 2021 to bring in some happy news for us.
I think we all are. I can say confidently this is one of my favorite things I get to do for this job. So anything and everything that Mike and I can do to improve this program, please let us know. Reach out to us. Let us know what you like. Let us know what you hate. Do you hate my voice? Please, I want to know it. But anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with us, and join us again in 2021 for season 4 of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast.